Carolina was immersed in her work when the call came, breaking her intense focus. Her office was often a quiet sanctuary, with soft lights and carefully organized books, but today it felt different. On the other end of the line was a familiar voice, her colleague Luisa, who had a tip on a case that struck her deeply. João, a 16-year-old black teenager, had been accused of theft in a local electronics store. From the moment she heard his name and the brief description, Carolina could feel a pang of something deeper, a recognition. The details seemed murky from the start, with no clear evidence or reliable witnesses, and she knew this story all too well. She could sense there was more to this than a simple accusation. After growing up in a neighborhood where she witnessed systemic injustice regularly, Carolina knew how easy it was for young black men to be unfairly targeted. She'd seen young men arrested simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and many weren't as lucky as she had been. Carolina herself had faced some of the same scrutiny, and each time she fought a case like this, she felt she was standing up not only for her clients, but for herself as well. The following day, Carolina arranged a meeting with João and his mother at her office. She spent time preparing, making sure the space was inviting and calming, and reminding herself of the weight this family must be carrying. As they entered, Carolina immediately saw a familiar fear in their eyes, a look she'd encountered so many times before. João, a tall and lanky teenager with dark, curious eyes, sat beside his mother, looking both angry and frightened. His hands were clenched tightly, his posture stiff and defensive. His mother, a soft-spoken woman with tired eyes, seemed on the verge of tears. "Thank you for seeing us," his mother began, her voice trembling. "We didn't know who else to turn to. They want to put my boy in jail, just for being there, for existing." She shook her head as if to shake off the injustice that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Carolina could see the toll this was taking on them both. Carolina nodded and met João's gaze directly. "João, can you tell me what happened, in your own words?" Her tone was steady and gentle, meant to let him know she was on his side. João took a shaky breath and began to recount the story. "I was at the store. I didn't take anything. I was just looking around, checking out headphones, that's all," he explained, his voice low but firm. "I'd never buy them. They're too expensive. But I was just curious, you know?" He looked away, embarrassed, as if even the thought of wanting something nice felt like a crime in itself. "When I decided to leave, this security guard was already following me, watching every move. He cornered me, accused me of stealing, and before I knew it, the police were there. They didn't even check the cameras, didn't even let me talk." His voice cracked, frustration visible on his face. Carolina felt a surge of anger rise within her. This young man was another victim of prejudice, condemned by a system that saw him as guilty long before he could defend himself. But she kept her composure, knowing she needed to project calm and confidence for him. "João, I want you to know that I believe you," she said firmly. "This won't be easy, but I promise to do everything I can to clear your name. We'll take this one step at a time." For the next hour, they went over every detail. Carolina probed gently but thoroughly, taking notes on each inconsistency in the security guard story. Every time João paused, his mother would squeeze his hand, silently reassuring him. Carolina could see the bond between them, the fierce love of a mother desperate to protect her child. As they prepared to leave, Carolina leaned in to reassure his mother, who looked at her with desperation. "Trust me," Carolina said, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "I'll fight for him as if he were my own." The following days were filled with relentless work. Carolina sought out anyone who could be an ally in the case, piecing together witness statements and studying the store's layout. She uncovered inconsistencies, finding that none of the evidence lined up as it should. But just as she began to feel some hope, she learned the name of the judge assigned to João's case: Eduardo Moura. Eduardo Moura was known for his rigid views, especially towards black men in their teens or 20s. Stories circulated of his harsh sentences, tales of families shattered by his decisions. Carolina had only been in his courtroom once before, but the memory was seared in her mind. He was unyielding, skeptical, and seemed to hold an underlying disdain for people from backgrounds like Joao's. She realized that she wasn't just fighting a flawed case. She was up against a system that had been built to work against her client. Sitting alone in her office that night, Carolina felt the weight of the task ahead. She knew the courtroom battles to come would be some of the hardest she'd fought. But as she gathered her notes, she whispered to herself, "For Joao, for all of them, I'll fight." On the morning of the trial, Carolina felt more determined than ever. With the case files securely held in a well-worn leather folder, she entered the courthouse, noting the cold, austere atmosphere of the courtroom awaiting her. The walls were a dull white, and the silence was only broken by the sound of footsteps from lawyers and officers taking their places. Carolina's gaze swept over every detail, but she couldn't shake the feeling of apprehension knowing that Judge Eduardo Mora would be presiding over Joao's case. Joao sat in the front row beside his mother. He wore a simple dress shirt and slacks, trying to present a serious image. Carolina could see a mixture of fear and fatigue in his eyes, signs of restless nights, and the emotional weight of this ordeal. His mother sat next to him, her hands clutching each other tightly on her lap, her face a mask of worry and love. Carolina knew that this trial wasn't just about the legal battle. It was about restoring Joao's dignity, his future, and helping this family who had been unjustly shaken. Taking a deep breath, Carolina approached them and greeted Joao and his mother softly. "Good morning, Joao. Are you ready?" she asked, giving him a reassuring look. Joao nodded, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "Yes, I think so," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Carolina gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, today is about showing the truth. Stay calm, and I'll handle the rest. Trust me," she said, trying to instill confidence in him. As they spoke, Carolina noticed that Judge Mora had just entered the courtroom. Eduardo Mora, a man in his mid-30s with a stern expression and piercing gaze, sat behind the judge's bench. Carolina couldn't help but remember the stories she'd heard about him. The unusually high rate of convictions he handed down, especially to young black men. She knew this trial wouldn't be easy, but seeing his expression made her even more determined. The room quickly quieted as Judge Mora called the court to order, his voice commanding attention. "Court is now in session," he announced, scanning the room briefly before landing his gaze on Joao, whose shoulders stiffened slightly under the judge's hard stare. Carolina's grip on her files tightened as she prepared to present her case. The prosecution began with a confident opening statement, painting Joao as a delinquent and attempting to position him as a habitual troublemaker without evidence. Carolina listened intently, making mental notes on each point. As the prosecutor continued his claims, it became clear that his argument relied more on assumptions than solid proof, a tactic that Judge Mora appeared ready to accept without question. Finally, it was Carolina's turn. She stood, composed and calm, and approached the center of the courtroom, locking eyes with the judge. "Your Honor, members of the court," she began, her voice strong but steady. "Today, I am here to defend a young man who has been wrongfully accused. Joao is not the delinquent that the prosecution describes. He is a student, a son, a young man with dreams and aspirations that do not involve crime. The evidence, or rather the lack thereof, will demonstrate his innocence." Carolina outlined her points carefully, highlighting the lack of witnesses, the biased nature of the accusation, and the failure of the police to check the security cameras thoroughly. She explained how Joao's presence in the electronic store that day was simply a case of wrong place, wrong time, compounded by an unfounded prejudice. Judge Mora listened, though his expression remained unreadable. Carolina felt the weight of his gaze, but she refused to let it unsettle her. She had faced judges like him before, men who believed they held all the power, who felt entitled to pass judgment without fully considering the individual standing before them. Carolina moved back to her seat, glancing briefly at Joao and his mother. Joao's mother gave her a small, grateful nod, her eyes filled with hope. Carolina felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would not let them down. The trial continued with witness testimonies. A security guard from the electronics store took the stand, describing Joao's behavior as suspicious. Carolina cross-examined him, calmly yet firmly challenging his assumptions. She asked, "Did you see Joao take any items?" The guard hesitated. "Well, no, but he was acting suspicious." Carolina continued, "Suspicious how? Simply because he looked at the products?" The guard shifted uncomfortably. I just thought he looked like trouble." Carolina's voice was steady as she responded. "Or did he look like trouble because of the color of his skin?" The courtroom grew silent, and Carolina could feel the weight of her words. Judge Mora cleared his throat, clearly unsettled, but said nothing. She knew this was only the beginning, and the battle would be hard-fought. The trial was in full swing, and Carolina felt the weight of her responsibility grow heavier with each passing moment. After the testimony of the security guard, the courtroom buzzed with whispers and murmurs. It was clear that some of the jurors were uncertain, their expressions shifting between disbelief and curiosity. Carolina knew she needed to capitalize on this moment of doubt to strengthen her case. The next witness called was a classmate of Joao's, a boy named Lucas, who had been with Joao at school for several years. As he took the stand, Carolina could see his nervousness. His hands trembled slightly, and he avoided making eye contact with anyone, clearly intimidated by the atmosphere of the courtroom. Carolina approached him gently, trying to ease his nerves. "Thank you for coming, Lucas," she began, her tone encouraging. "Can you tell the court about your friendship with Joao?" Lucas nodded slowly, his voice shaky. Joao is he's a good guy. We've been friends since middle school. He's never done anything bad, not like what they're saying." Carolina smiled reassuringly. "And what kind of student is he?" "He's really smart," Lucas replied, gaining a bit of confidence. "He's in the honors program, and he helps others with their homework. He's always trying to do the right thing." "Thank you, Lucas. So, on the day of the alleged theft, where were you?" "I was at home. I heard about what happened later," Lucas explained. "I couldn't believe it. Joao would never do something like that." Carolina saw the jurors nodding slightly. She knew this was a pivotal moment. "Did you see Joao at the electronics store that day?" she pressed gently. Lucas hesitated, glancing at the prosecution before answering. "No, I wasn't there, but I know him. He wouldn't steal anything." "Your Honor," Carolina said, addressing Judge Mora, "I have no further questions." As Lucas stepped down, Carolina felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was the kind of character witness she needed. Someone who could vouch for Joao's integrity and character. She glanced at Joao, who looked slightly more relaxed, though the tension in the air was still palpable. Next, Carolina decided to call upon the store manager, a woman named Elena, who had been present during the incident. As she took the stand, Carolina felt a surge of hope. Elena was known for being fair-minded and had a reputation for treating her employees and customers with respect. "Thank you for being here today, Ms. Elena," Carolina began, her voice steady. "Can you please explain what you witnessed on the day of the alleged theft?" Elena cleared her throat, her expression serious. "I was in the back of the store when I heard the commotion. I came out to see what was happening. By the time I got there, the police were already on the scene. Did you see Joao at any point during this?" Carolina asked. "No, I didn't see him at all," Elena replied firmly. "In fact, I never saw anyone actually take anything. It all happened so quickly, and I was just trying to understand what was going on." Carolina felt her heart lift at this testimony. "So, to be clear, you're saying that you have no evidence of theft occurring, correct?" "Correct," Elena confirmed, meeting Carolina's gaze. "Thank you, Ms. Elena. No further questions," Carolina said, stepping back with a sense of triumph. As Elena left the stand, Carolina could see some jurors exchanging glances. The tide was slowly turning in Joao's favor. However, she knew she needed more to sway Judge Mora. As the trial continued, Carolina received a note from her assistant, Javier. He had been diligently researching the judge's previous rulings and came across some alarming statistics. Judge Mora had a pattern of harsh sentencing against young black defendants, often based on flimsy evidence. Carolina felt a mix of anger and determination. This was systemic racism at play, and she had to find a way to expose it. Later that day, after a brief recess, Carolina stood up and asked for permission to address the court once more. "Your Honor, I would like to present additional evidence, she stated, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. Proceed, Judge Mora replied, his tone indifferent. Carolina took a deep breath and began. I have conducted research on previous rulings made by this court under Your Honor's jurisdiction. I found that young black defendants face a disproportionate number of convictions in cases with minimal evidence. This systemic issue cannot be overlooked. Judge Mora's eyes narrowed, and Carolina could feel the tension in the room. You are treading on thin ice, Ms. Carolina. Focus on the case at hand, he warned, but she pressed on. I'm focusing on the case, Your Honor. This is not just about Joao. It's about the larger picture of how individuals are treated within this court system. We need to ensure justice is served fairly, not influenced by bias. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and for the first time, Carolina sensed a crack in the judge's stern facade. The jurors were listening intently, and she could see their expressions changing, slowly but surely. Your Honor, she continued, the presumption of innocence must prevail, and it cannot be overshadowed by preconceived notions based on race. I ask for a fair and unbiased ruling in this case. Judge Morris sat back in his chair, visibly agitated but unable to silence the growing murmurs among the jurors. Carolina took this moment to glance at Joao, whose face showed a mixture of hope and disbelief. She was fighting for his future, and for the first time, she felt like she might be making an impact. As the day came to a close, Carolina packed her things, heart racing. She had ignited a spark, but she knew the battle was far from over. Would it be enough to sway Judge Mora and the jury? Only time would tell. Chapter 3, Le Tournant. As the sun cast its golden rays through the courthouse windows, Carolina prepared herself for what could be the most crucial day of the trial. The previous day's proceedings had brought a glimmer of hope, but she knew the real test lay ahead. Today, she planned to call forth a key witness, an eyewitness whose testimony could sway the jury's opinion. The clock ticked ominously, reminding her of the limited time they had. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt charged, electric with anticipation. Carolina took a deep breath, adjusting her blazer as she walked toward the jury box. Your Honor, I would like to call my next witness, she stated, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Proceed, Judge Mora replied, his tone still tinged with skepticism. Carolina gestured to the back of the courtroom, where a young black man named Daniel stood nervously. He was in his early 20s, dressed in casual clothes, his face revealing the burden of the moment. As he walked to the witness stand, Carolina felt a mix of admiration and empathy for him. She knew he was taking a significant risk by speaking out. Thank you for being here today, Daniel, Carolina began, her tone warm and encouraging. Can you please tell the court what you witnessed on the day of the alleged theft? Daniel hesitated, glancing briefly at Joao, who was seated at the defendant's table. I was in the store that day. I was buying some snacks, he started, his voice shaking slightly. When I heard the commotion, I looked over. I saw Joao standing there, but I didn't see him take anything. Carolina seized the moment, her heart racing with a newfound sense of purpose. Daniel, can you clarify what you mean by that? Did you see anyone else acting suspiciously? Daniel took a deep breath, nodding. Yeah, there were some kids nearby. They were being loud and running around, but I didn't see Joao do anything wrong. He was just standing there. A murmur spread through the courtroom as Carolina exchanged a glance with Joao, who looked relieved yet still anxious. Thank you, Daniel. Your testimony is crucial, she said, allowing a small smile to break through her serious demeanor. Did you get a good look at the police officers when they arrived? Yes, Daniel replied, his brow furrowed. They were really aggressive. I remember thinking it was overkill for just some noise in the store. They seemed to be looking for someone to blame. Carolina pressed on. And did you notice how they treated Joao when they approached him? They were rough, Daniel stated, his voice rising slightly. They didn't ask him any questions first. They just grabbed him. It didn't seem right. This was the turning point Carolina had hoped for. She could sense the jury leaning in, captivated by Daniel's account. With each passing second, she felt a surge of hope. No further questions, Your Honor, Carolina concluded, feeling as though she had set the stage for a pivotal moment. As Daniel stepped down from the witness stand, Carolina could see the jury exchanging glances, the mood shifting in her favor. Yet, the specter of Judge Mora's biases loomed over the proceedings. Carolina needed to address this directly if she was to secure justice for Joao. After a brief recess, Carolina stood before the court once more. "Your Honor," she began, locking eyes with Judge Mora, "I would like to address the nature of the testimony we just heard." The judge's expression hardened, but he nodded for her to continue. "The evidence presented today, particularly Daniel's testimony, underscores the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case," Carolina asserted, her voice unwavering. "We cannot allow preconceived notions to cloud our judgment. This trial is not just about Joao. It reflects the integrity of our justice system. We must confront the racial biases that threaten its foundation." Judge Morris shifted in his seat, visibly agitated by her words. "Are you suggesting that the court is influenced by bias, Ms. Carolina?" "Yes, Your Honor. Statistics have shown a pattern of prejudice in sentencing young black defendants. The system is rigged against them," she stated, feeling the weight of her words. "We have an opportunity here to correct that narrative, to ensure that justice prevails without the taint of racism." The room buzzed with murmurs as her words resonated with the audience. Carolina noticed the jury's expression soften, their attentiveness intensifying. She could see the glimmers of doubt about the prosecution's case flickering in their eyes. "Your Honor, I implore you to remember that justice is not merely a word we say. It is a principle we must uphold for everyone equally," Carolina continued, her heart racing. "We cannot allow race to dictate outcomes in this courtroom." For a moment, silence engulfed the room. The tension was palpable as Carolina held her breath, waiting for Judge Mora's response. After a lengthy pause, he finally spoke, his voice tinged with irritation. "You are treading a fine line, Ms. Carolina. Focus on the case at hand." Carolina's resolve hardened, refusing to back down. "I will focus on ensuring that this case is heard fairly and justly, Your Honor. This is not just Joao's fight. It's a fight for justice for all." As the court session concluded for the day, Carolina felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had taken risks, challenged the system, and for the first time it felt like they were making headway. But the journey was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she needed to be ready. The next day dawned with an air of unease in the courthouse. Carolina felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on her shoulders as she prepared for the next phase of the trial. The prosecution had hinted at introducing new evidence that could potentially undermine her case. She needed to stay sharp and focused. As she entered the courtroom, she noticed that the mood was decidedly different. The jury looked tense, their expressions serious. Carolina sat down, exchanging a brief nod with Joao, who sat with his lawyer, visibly anxious. "Court is now in session," Judge Mora declared, his voice authoritative as he took his seat. The prosecutor, a wiry man named Drummond, stood up, adjusting his glasses as he prepared to address the court. "Your Honor, I would like to present new evidence that supports our case," Drummond said, his tone confident. He gestured to a police officer who stepped forward, holding a file. "This report outlines the events leading to the arrest of the defendant. It includes statements from the arresting officers detailing the actions of the suspect at the time of the incident." Carolina's heart sank as Drummond handed the report to the judge. She leaned forward, straining to catch the words that might seal Joao's fate. "I object," she interjected, her voice firm. "This evidence was not disclosed during the pretrial hearings, and its late introduction compromises my ability to prepare a proper defense." "Your objection is noted," Judge Mora replied, looking through the documents. "However, I will allow the evidence to be presented. We will assess its relevance as we proceed." The prosecutor smiled triumphantly. "Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to call Officer Rivera to the stand." The officer stepped forward, his uniform crisp and demeanor composed. As he took the oath, Carolina studied him, searching for any signs of bias or dishonesty. The officer's testimony could either solidify the prosecution's case or be the key to unraveling it. "Officer Rivera, can you describe the events that led to the arrest of Mr. Joao Santos?" Drummond asked, his tone unyielding. Of course, Rivera replied, his voice steady. When we arrived at the scene, we received reports of theft. Upon entering the store, we observed Mr. Santos behaving suspiciously. He was standing near the exit, looking around nervously. Did you ask him any questions before detaining him? Carolina interrupted, rising to her feet. Rivera hesitated. We approached him and asked if he was okay. He seemed agitated, so we decided to question him further. But you didn't let him explain himself before taking him into custody, correct? Carolina pressed, her heart racing. Isn't it true that you assumed his guilt based on his appearance alone? Objection, Your Honor, Drummond interjected. This line of questioning is irrelevant. Overruled, Judge Mora responded. Proceed, Ms. Carolina. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, regaining her focus. Officer Rivera, is it common practice for your department to profile individuals based solely on their appearance? The officer shifted uncomfortably. We follow protocols when responding to calls, he replied evasively. Protocols that allow for racial profiling? Carolina pressed further. Did you consider any other explanations for Joao's behavior? For instance, that he was simply a customer who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rivera's expression tightened. In the heat of the moment, we make decisions based on the information we have. Carolina leaned in, sensing an opportunity. And yet, your decisions led to the wrongful arrest of an innocent man, didn't they? Your Honor, this is speculative, Drummond protested, but Carolina could see a crack in Rivera's confidence. I'm not speculating, officer, she countered. I'm asking you to consider the implications of your actions. If you had taken the time to investigate further, perhaps this trial wouldn't even be necessary. Rivera's demeanor wavered slightly. I was following orders, he muttered, his voice dropping. Is that your excuse for not ensuring justice? Carolina pressed, her voice steady. A system that protects its officers instead of its citizens is a broken system. The courtroom fell silent. The tension was palpable as Carolina's words hung in the air, challenging not only Rivera, but the entire justice system. She could see the jury reacting, their expressions shifting as they processed her arguments. After a brief pause, Judge Moore interjected, That's enough, Ms. Carolina. Let's not lose sight of the facts of the case. But Carolina knew she had planted the seeds of doubt. As Rivera stepped down, the prosecutor's confidence seemed to wane. She could sense the jury's change in perception, and it invigorated her. In the following moments, Carolina called her next witness, a local community leader named Mrs. Harris. An elderly woman with a commanding presence. She had been a longtime advocate for social justice and knew the community well. Mrs. Harris, Carolina began, can you tell us about Joao's character and reputation in the community? He's a good man, always helping others, Mrs. Harris said, her voice strong. He's known for his kindness and his willingness to lend a hand. This accusation is not only unfounded, it's damaging to his character. Thank you. Can you speak to the issue of racial profiling in our community? Carolina continued, determined to reinforce her point. Yes, I can, Mrs. Harris replied, her expression serious. Racial profiling is rampant in our city. We see it time and time again, where individuals are judged by the color of their skin rather than their actions. Joao's case is just one of many. Carolina felt a surge of hope. Isn't it true that the community is tired of being treated as suspects rather than citizens? Absolutely, Mrs. Harris responded, her passion evident. We deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, not as criminals by default. As the session continued, Carolina realized she was no longer just defending Joao. She was championing a larger cause. Each witness, she called, added to the narrative of injustice, exposing the flaws in the system that had failed so many. But as she prepared for the next phase, Carolina couldn't shake the feeling that the prosecution still had one more trick up its sleeve. Drummond had been unusually quiet, and she sensed he was biding his time. As the day wrapped up, Carolina remained hopeful but cautious. They had made significant progress, but the battle was far from over. The truth was on their side, but now they had to fight for it against a system that was all too ready to dismiss it. The courtroom was buzzing as the sixth day of the trial began. The atmosphere was charged with palpable tension, everyone in the room feeling like part of a fight for the truth. Carolina, having regrouped her strength, stood before the jury, ready to continue her plea for Joao. That day, she knew she had to change her strategy. The previous testimonies had been valuable, but they had not been enough to convince the jury of her client's innocence. She needed to present undeniable evidence, something that would shift the trial's outcome in Joao's favor. Your Honor, Carolina began, today, I wish to call a civil rights expert, Dr. Samuel King. He has extensively studied racial profiling and its effects on minority communities. I believe his testimony is essential to this case. Drummond immediately objected. Objection, Your Honor. This witness is here to express opinions, not facts. Your Honor, Dr. King's testimony is crucial to establish the context of systemic biases that affect cases like this. Carolina countered, her determination renewed. After a brief deliberation, Judge Mora raised his hand. I will allow the testimony, but with caution. Carolina turned towards the door. Dr. King entered, wearing rectangular glasses and a confident smile. He had spent years studying systemic racism, and his expertise would be invaluable. Thank you for being here, Dr. King, Carolina began. Can you explain to us what racial profiling is and how it manifests in our society? Of course, he replied, his strong voice resonating in the courtroom. Racial profiling is the practice of targeting individuals based on their race or ethnicity rather than their behavior. It creates a culture of mistrust and fear, where people are often seen as guilty before they even have a chance to prove their innocence. And how does this manifest in interactions with law enforcement? Carolina asked. It fosters prejudice, Dr. King explained. Officers may see a person of color and, without any evidence, assume they are suspicious. This can lead to unjust arrests like that of Joao. The courtroom fell silent. Carolina could sense that the jury was absorbing every word. Do you think the police culture plays a role in this phenomenon? She asked. Absolutely, Dr. King replied. Police departments that lack training on diversity and inclusion create an environment where racism can thrive. Officers often act on stereotypes, leading to violations of civil rights. Carolina straightened up, aware that her arguments were resonating. In other words, the biases of some officers can lead to abuses of power, correct? That's right, Dr. King confirmed. Thank you, Dr. King, Carolina said, a satisfied smile on her face. She knew she had done well, but she needed to do more. She turned to the jury, giving them an intense look. You've heard testimonies that shed light on the true nature of the accusations against Joao. Dr. King has highlighted how systemic biases led to this arrest. Now, I will show you a video taken by a witness of the incident. She played the video on the screen. The jury watched intently. In the footage, Joao was seen leaving the store, looking confused and anxious. The video also captured the officers approaching him, their movements brusque and threatening. Whispers rippled through the room as jurors took note of the intensity of the situation. Carolina turned to the jury, her voice filled with emotion. What you see here is not just an arrest. It's a clear demonstration of how racial profiling can lead to devastating consequences. We are not talking about a simple theft. We are talking about a man's life, his dignity, and his right to a fair trial. She paused, letting her words resonate. Do you truly believe Joao deserves this treatment? Do you think this should be the norm for members of our community? The silence was deafening. Carolina felt the tension heightening. She could almost touch the hope radiating from the room. But as the day progressed, she knew Drummond would not let this opportunity slip away. She had to be prepared. That will be all for this witness, she announced, returning to her bench. The smile on Carolina's face was temporary, for she knew the final battle was approaching. The prosecution had already planned a counterattack, but she was ready for anything. This was not just a trial. It was a fight for justice, and she was not about to back down. As the seventh day of the trial dawned, a sense of urgency hung in the air. Carolina could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it, the final push to unravel the layers of injustice that had enveloped Joao since the very beginning. The courtroom was packed, with eyes glued to the proceedings. Carolina stood at her table, her heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and determination. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but urgent. "Today I will call my final witness, someone who can shed light on the events of that fateful day from a unique perspective. I would like to call Mr. Lucas Pereira to the stand." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as Lucas, a young man in his 20s, took the stand. He was a local resident and had witnessed the arrest. Carolina had approached him after hearing his account from another witness, and he agreed to testify, understanding the importance of his perspective. "Mr. Pereira, can you please tell the court what you saw on the day of Joao's arrest?" Carolina asked, her eyes locked on him. Lucas nodded, his brow furrowing with concentration. "I was walking by the store when I saw Joao leave. He looked nervous, like he didn't know what to do. Suddenly, I saw the police approach him aggressively. They didn't even ask him any questions. They just grabbed him and started pushing him around." "What did you hear during this encounter?" Carolina pressed. "I heard Joao say, 'I didn't do anything. Why are you doing this?'" Lucas recounted, his voice trembling slightly. "It broke my heart to see him treated that way. He was just a kid trying to live his life." Drummond jumped up, interjecting, "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. The witness can't speak for the defendant's state of mind." "Your Honor," Carolina responded, maintaining her composure, "the witness is sharing his observations and how he felt at that moment, which is crucial for establishing the context of the incident." Judge Mora leaned back, contemplating. "I will allow the testimony." "Proceed, Mr. Pereira." Carolina turned back to Lucas. "Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Pereira, did you notice anything unusual about the police's behavior during this encounter?" "Yes," Lucas replied, gaining confidence. "They seemed really aggressive, almost like they were looking for a reason to arrest him. It didn't make sense. Joao was just standing there, and they treated him like a criminal." "Thank you. Did you see any other individuals in the area at that time?" Carolina continued. "Yes, there were a few other people around, but most of them were just as confused as I was. They were staring at the scene, but no one dared to step in. I could see the fear in their eyes." Carolina nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard a first-hand account of the events that led to Joao's unjust arrest. A young man was not just treated as a suspect. He was dehumanized in front of bystanders who were powerless to intervene. This is a reality that many people of color face daily in our society." The jury looked visibly moved. Carolina seized the moment, her voice rising with passion. "This is not just about one boy's life. It's about the systemic issues that lead to such brutality. Joao deserves justice, and it's time to right this wrong." Drummond, desperate to regain control, jumped to his feet again. "Your Honor, this is pure emotion. The prosecution is trying to sway the jury with sentiments instead of facts." "Objection overruled," Judge Mora replied, eyeing Drummond sternly. "The witness's feelings are relevant to the case." Carolina pressed on, her heart racing. "Mr. Pereira, in your opinion, what impact did this incident have on you and those who witnessed it?" Lucas paused for a moment, as if weighing the significance of his answer. "It made me realize how fragile our sense of safety is. We should be able to trust the police, but seeing how they treated Joao made me feel like anyone could be next. It was terrifying." "Thank you, Mr. Pereira," Carolina said, her voice steady. She returned to her seat, letting the jury digest the gravity of Lucas's testimony. But she knew Drummond would not let this go unchallenged. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, he stood up again. "I would like to cross-examine the witness," he said, his tone condescending. "Proceed," Judge Morris said, gesturing for him to continue. Drummond approached the stand, his demeanor shifting. "Mr. Pereira, you say you witnessed this altercation, correct? But you were also a bystander. Can you really judge the police's actions without knowing what they were responding to?" "I can judge based on what I saw," Lucas replied defiantly. "Joao didn't pose a threat. The officers acted irrationally. So, you're saying that because you didn't see Joao commit a crime, you believe he shouldn't have been arrested?" Drummond pressed, attempting to twist Lucas's words. "No," Lucas retorted. "I'm saying the way they treated him was wrong. You don't treat people like that unless you have a reason to." Drummond sneered, clearly frustrated. And your feelings about this incident don't constitute evidence, do they? No, but they do represent a reality many of us face. Lucas shot back, standing his ground. The police need to be held accountable for their actions, especially when they harm innocent people. Drummond huffed and turned back to the jury, attempting to sway their thoughts. You see, ladies and gentlemen, this witness is just as emotional as the prosecution. His perspective is clouded by his personal feelings, which have no place in this courtroom. Carolina felt the pressure rising again, but maintained her composure. She had anticipated Drummond's tactics and knew she needed to close strong. Your Honor, Carolina said, standing up again, I would like to address Drummond's comments. Mr. Pereira is not just a bystander. He represents the voices of many who have witnessed injustice but are too afraid to speak out. It's time we listen to those voices and consider the impact of systemic racism in our society. The jury looked visibly shaken, and Carolina felt a surge of hope. This trial isn't just about the facts, it's about lives. It's about the future of our communities and the importance of standing up for what's right. As the courtroom buzzed with whispers, Carolina returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She knew they were approaching the climax of this trial. The tension in the air was thick, and every eye was on the judge, awaiting his next decision. Court will recess until tomorrow, Judge Mora announced, and the gavel struck the bench, echoing through the tense atmosphere. As the people filed out, Carolina exchanged glances with Joao. She could see the glimmer of hope in his eyes. They were one step closer to justice, but the final battle awaited them. The final day of the trial dawned with a sense of foreboding in the air. Carolina arrived early at the courthouse, her mind racing with thoughts of the previous days. As she stepped into the courtroom, she noticed a quiet intensity in the atmosphere. It felt as if the walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation. Joao sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together, a mixture of anxiety and hope etched on his face. Carolina took a moment to gather her thoughts, feeling the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. Today was not just about defending Joao. It was about confronting the deep-seated biases that plague their justice system. As the judge entered, the courtroom settled into silence, the air thick with tension. Court is now in session, Judge Mora announced, his voice resonating through the room. He glanced at Carolina, then at Drummond, before turning his attention to the jury. Have you reached a verdict? The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged man with a furrowed brow, stood up. Yes, Your Honor, we have reached a verdict. Carolina's heart raced as she leaned forward, eager yet anxious to hear the decision that could change Joao's life forever. On the charge of theft, we find the defendant. The words hung in the air, suspended in time. The room was so quiet that the sound of a pin dropping could have echoed. Not guilty. A wave of relief washed over Carolina. She felt tears prick at her eyes as she glanced at Joao, whose face broke into a wide grin. The tension that had built over the past days began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of justice served. Judge Mora's gavel struck the bench. Order in the court, he commanded, but his voice was drowned out by the murmurs of astonishment and joy from the spectators. Carolina rose to her feet, a triumphant smile on her face as she looked around the courtroom. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Thank you to the jury for seeing the truth. This is not just a victory for Joao, but a victory against the prejudices that can cloud judgment. Drummond, still reeling from the unexpected outcome, rose to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. Your Honor, I request a mistrial. The jury's decision is based on emotional appeal rather than facts. Objection denied, Judge Mora replied firmly, adjusting his glasses. The jury has made their decision. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom began to empty, Carolina rushed over to Joao, who was now standing, his eyes bright with disbelief and joy. You did it, she exclaimed, pulling him into a tight embrace. You're free. Thank you, Carolina, he replied, his voice choked with emotion. I never thought this day would come. You believed in me when no one else did. I knew you were innocent, Carolina said, her heart swelling with pride. This is just the beginning, Joao. We need to work on raising awareness about the systemic issues that led to your wrongful arrest. As they stepped out of the courtroom, they were met with a throng of reporters, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Carolina, Joao, how do you feel about the verdict? One reporter shouted. Carolina took a deep breath, preparing herself for the onslaught of questions. This case is a reminder of the work that still needs to be done, she began, her voice steady. We must continue to fight against racial bias and injustice in our legal system. Today is a victory, but it's not the end. Joao stepped beside her, his confidence shining through. I just want to go home and live my life. No one should have to go through what I did. We need to change this system for everyone. As they made their way through the crowd, Carolina felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the fight was far from over, but today had shown her the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for what is right. Later that evening, as Carolina sat in her office, she reflected on the trial's outcome. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. She thought about the people who had supported her and Joao throughout this journey, the allies who stood against injustice. She knew she had to channel this energy into advocacy work to ensure that no one else faced the same struggle that Joao had endured. Tomorrow, we start planning, she whispered to herself, determination surging within her. I'll create a program to educate others about their rights and work to reform the system from within. With a sense of hope and excitement for the future, Carolina closed her laptop, ready to take on the challenges ahead.